couldn't believe this statistic when I heard it. Today, 80% of Americans check their phones within 10 minutes of waking up. But why? Well, by now you've probably heard the standard reasons. You've probably heard about the dopamine released from likes on social media, or algorithms' ability to feed you personalized ads and recommendations. But now I'd like to suggest a different factor in play here. One that, if you can understand how it operates, can completely change your relationship not just to your phone, but also the internet and information altogether. To get to the bottom of this, we need to start with two phenomena: a space bias and a time bias. The communications mediums of every age, they have one or the other, a space bias or a time bias. So let's say that you lived in the 18th or the 19th century. Well, back then, your ideas or your thought processes, they were mostly shaped based on where you lived. And if you needed to find new ideas that other people hadn't heard of and escape the present ways of thinking, you basically had to travel to other places. And this is what I mean when I say space bias. Moving media and information, it was so expensive that information just tended to be local. And so people, their ideas and their thinking, it was shaped and influenced mostly by what was created in their local geography. And then because it took so long for new books to arrive in different places, people didn't have access to fresh information. And so because of that, they studied old books, some of them written decades or maybe even centuries before. But today, it's the complete opposite. We live in a world where travel is cheap and information, it moves at the speed of light. Open any news website and you will find tons of articles about recent happenings from every corner of the world: Africa, Asia, South America, North America, everywhere. In 30 seconds of scrolling my own Twitter feed, I'll see messages from San Francisco, New York, Thailand, England, France, China, Japan, Singapore, and all of them published in the last 24 hours. But when I scroll the internet, I rarely find anything that was created more than a year ago, 10 years ago, and never 100 years ago. And this points to our time bias, where the information that we consume is now based on recency instead of geography. But what's the problem with a time bias? Moving from a space bias to a time bias has caused us to get stuck in the present. And that present is never ending. So now we're caught in a constant loop where we're consuming new information, and we're following these feeds from YouTube to Twitter to Facebook to Instagram to TikTok. And these feeds, they're constantly churning out new content and they're never ending. So I came up with this idea of the never ending now when I was living in New York. And at the time I used to throw these parties. And so what we would do is we'd get a company to sponsor the parties. We'd invite a bunch of Instagram influencers, YouTube influencers. And one night the party had ended and we were going to a comedy show. And so we rent one of those Uber SUVs and I go to the back of the SUV. And I have to squeeze through, do gymnastics to get back there. And it's a 20-minute drive to the comedy club. And I'm sitting back there and I'm just like a little anthropologist here, just sort of stalking what's everyone looking at on their phones. And I couldn't believe it. There were 5 people in front of me and every single one of them only consumed things that had been created in the last 24 hours during that car ride. Snapchat stories, Instagram stories, Twitter feeds, Facebook, text messages, whatever it was, everything was new. And I saw that the architecture of their information environments, the ways that they had set up their phones, made it impossible for them to be consuming old ideas. There were too many pings, and then all their social media feeds, they had this recency bias. So what ends up happening is even though we're consuming more information than ever, people aren't that much more educated. Think of how hard it is now for people to read a full book, let alone the great books, let alone the core works of philosophy and sociology and religion. And social media isn't directing me to the best ideas that have ever been made, but rather the most recent ones. That is the product of a time bias. And even though I saw this problem in my own life, this isn't just a me thing. I ain't the only one here. This is a problem that plagues just about everybody. But we don't even know it. I mean, have you ever thought about what the constant production and consumption of a 24-hour news cycle does to our minds? And how new that is as a concept in human history? The truth is that most of what we read in the news is manufactured and rarely offers deep insights. It's designed to be sensational and to get an emotional reaction out of you. And I learned this when I was working in a newsroom and I watched these tactics come into play. I watched them be encouraged. And this leads us to missing out on a lot of deeper undercurrents that are happening in culture and society because we're so focused on topical trends rather than the long-term ones. I love the way that Seth Godin explains this when he talks about the current and the wind analogy, where he says that a novice sailor, they'll focus on the winds because you go out to the dock and you can feel those winds, they're buzzing all over the place, and they're always changing. But an experienced sailor, they're more interested in the currents. And this is because even though the winds are always changing, the currents are persistent. And even though they're invisible, a strong current can overtake the wind any day. And I think that we should focus on the currents of society more than the winds, because that's where the real gold lies. And the news is those winds, where the books are the currents. Think of it as reading a 300-word news article versus a 300-page book. Every page in that book is the result of years of thinking. But the news article, it's much more impulsive, right? It's written with the purpose of meeting a deadline, something that they have to hit every day within that 24-hour news cycle. And with the book, you're getting ideas that have been discussed and explored and debated in tremendous depth. Each sentence carries weight in that book, if it's a good one. And so, by only consuming ideas that have been created in the last 24 hours, when we do that, we're missing out on wisdom. And what you're doing when you get stuck and trapped in that news cycle is you're focusing on the winds rather than the currents. And that is the sign of a novice. I've published hundreds of thousands of words on my website in the past couple years, and I find that the best pieces that I write are generally just the ones that I've spent a lot of time on. They're the ones that I'll think about deeply for months. I'll talk to friends about them, get their feedback. I'll work with my editor, she'll help me out, and I'll just spend hours going for a walk and just thinking about the implications of what I'm saying. But the question is, for you as a consumer, how do you actually get out of this cycle of the never-ending now? The best way to do this is by creating a balance between a space and a time bias. It may be easy to give into the impulse of consuming as much recent news as possible. But what you need to do is to consciously step away from this impulse, from this FOMO of reading what everybody else is reading, and start reading more books and fewer articles. Start getting away from the humdrum of the news and start saying what's going to be relevant in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. And yeah, if you gotta read the news, well, set aside a time of day where you exclusively do that, fine. But then do yourself a favor and spend the rest of your time focusing on ideas that are older, that are more sustainable, more thought-provoking, and that are the currents. And instead of scrolling social media on your phone, just put it away and read a book for an hour before bed. Now, you might be wondering, what exactly am I getting by breaking out of this cycle? The answer is simple. I look for ideas and for information that has stood the test of time. And as you learn those timeless ideas, what you're doing is you're weaving together a tapestry of knowledge that compounds in value. You're bringing in layers of thought that have been examined and questioned and edited, rather than things that have just been written under impulse and short deadlines. And maybe the most valuable part of escaping the never-ending now is it's going to help you come up with better ideas of your own. But we can't do that if we're always consuming information that was created impulsively. And all this made me wonder if the internet is actually making us stupider as a species, which is a question that I explore in this video.